Norman said, I am a local businessman, not a politician, and I'm sure in a few minutes you'll understand I'm not a professional speaker. Most importantly, I'm a husband, I'm a father, thank you. I'm a husband, I'm a father, and a grandfather. And my greatest concern is about the future of our country and the effect it's going to have on my children and my grandchildren. I may not be here for many more years, but I'm concerned about what they're going to have to face in the coming years. I've spent most of my adult life really just trying to mind my own business, trying to provide for my family. Every time there's an election, I try to educate myself on the issues. I try to educate myself on the candidates. And I've always been faithful to vote. But frankly, I realize that I've been asleep. There's been a lot going on behind the scenes in our nation that I wasn't aware of. Our nation has been steadily moving away from personal responsibility and been moving towards socialistic principles for many years. But it seems like in the last 2 years, that move has increased at warp speed. As a result of observing this, I've spent for about 2 years now all of my spare time reading and studying and trying to understand economics, trying to understand the proper role of government, studying American history and studying about the founding that our first speaker explained to us so eloquently. I've been studying the Declaration of Independence particularly and the Constitution. And I've been reading tons of books. I just attended the Tea Party conference out in Phoenix, and on my return trip home, my carry-on luggage was nothing but books. I love the wisdom of people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams that I read every week. And so what I'm saying is I've been trying to educate myself on the principles that allow our nation to enjoy the greatest prosperity and the greatest freedom that any nation has had in the history of the world. I believe that our nation today is facing the greatest danger to its existence since our founding. We're faced with an overwhelming number of problems, and it's sometimes hard to figure out which one should I fight. I can't do them all. We're in a battle to save this nation, and I believe that we need to try to strike the head of the stake instead of trying to cut off small pieces of this table. And so in my study, there's two root problems that have kind of made themselves evident to me. They're certainly not the only problems, but I think these two problems represent the head of the snake that we need to cut off. One has to do with our moral character. We've lost our moral compass in this nation. And frankly, our keynote speaker gave a beautiful prayer this morning or this afternoon, and he demonstrated that loss of character that's evident in our country today. And I recently heard a statistic that said that 40% of our citizens now make a living by voting rather than working. That reflects a loss of moral character. Thomas Sowell, in one of his books that I love, has little random thoughts in the back for any of you that may read his books. And he said, you know the old adage about give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. He said that adage has been updated. He said nowadays if you give a man a fish, he's going to demand tartar sauce and french fries to go with it. And moreover, some politician who wants his vote is going to claim that that's his basic right. So the second root problem after morality has to do with our understanding of rights. And that's going to be the focus of my discussion today. Unless we return to the founders' understanding of rights that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, we have no hope of ever getting our nation back on sound financial footing. And we have no hope to ever get back to enjoying the kind of liberties that were designed in our Constitution that our founders fought for. The term rights has become so overused in our society that it's become marginalized. True rights have become violated in order to grant false rights to people that had no rights. True rights have been distorted, first of all, by some very well-meaning people. Some people that confuse rights with needs. Some people who confuse good causes with rights. And some other people that confuse rights with benefits that we'd like to see everybody enjoy. I wish every citizen of this nation had a very nice house, 2 cars, all the amenities, could take great vacations. But the fact that I'd like to see them have it doesn't mean they have a right to those things. Those things don't just exist out there for us to go pick off of a tree the way that we pick an apple. Politicians are the second group that have abused our rights, and they cleverly attach the term rights to favors that they want to grant to certain groups in exchange for their votes, in exchange for their campaign donations. All political favors come at the expense of the rest of us who are tax-paying citizens. Calling those favors rights helps remove the guilt of those groups who want to live by using the rest of us citizens for their benefit. Rights is really an emotional term, and it conveys the idea that if we don't grant that right, then somehow we deprive some people of true justice. Using this term in this way can create false guilt, and then it can be used to manipulate citizens to vote for programs that violate the legitimate rights of other people. Anytime the true meaning of rights becomes confused, justice will always be perverted. Calling something a right doesn't make it a right any more than naming your dog Kitty makes him a cat. Therefore, it's very important that we begin to be able to distinguish between legitimate rights and dogs named Kitty. Let's start with, where do rights come from? If I ask you where do we get rights, no doubt you mention things like contracts. I get rights from joining organizations. I may get rights from being affiliated with corporations. All of those we don't too much care about today, because those are voluntary choices that we make, and the rights and obligations that come with them are based on our voluntary choices. I'm more concerned with rights that have to do with the government. And there are certain types of governments that dictate rights. If you live under a dictatorship, then your rights are at the discrimination of the dictator. And your rights are not secure. They can change by the hour based on the mood of the dictator. You may have had a certain right yesterday, and today you no longer have that right. And then there's governments like an oligarchy. That's just a fancy word that means ruled by a few. In essence, in my mind, an oligarchy is nothing but a handful of dictators ruling you instead of a single dictator. And so your rights are still violated. Well, then we come to a democracy. And we always talk about our country being a democracy. In the pure democracy, the rule is by a majority of the voters, 50% plus one vote. In fact, when we have very low turnouts in elections, your rights in a majority could be determined by as few as 15 or 20% of the people who happen to vote. So again, your rights can change quickly. In all of these scenarios that I'm talking about, we're talking about a situation where we view the source of rights as coming from man. That's what's promoted in much of what's taught in our schools today. It's certainly very what's practiced in our government today. You see the danger in your rights resting in man. Obviously, the first danger is that the entity that grants you the right is the entity that can take away your right. So you have no security when your rights rest in man. The second danger is that your rights will always lack consistency, because men have widely divergent views on what's the right thing to do. And so your rights will not be consistent. But the most important danger that comes, and it has to do with the frailty of man. When we talk about man's frailty, we're talking about man's tendency towards self-centeredness. We're talking about what Christians refer to as original sin, or man's fallen nature. We as human beings have an infinite capacity to rationalize just about anything that we really want to do. And when you put man in government and give him the power, and he can determine what he wants to do, then man's rights are in trouble. Let me give you a scenario that might help illustrate this. Suppose you and two of your friends go out here in the Gulf 50 or 100 miles, and you discover a brand new island. Nobody's ever seen it. It's got good water, good natural resources. It doesn't belong to anyone. So the three of you claim that island for your own, and nobody disputes that. You've got your own island. You divide the land equally between you. You're all happy with the parcel of land that you have, and you go about making a life for yourselves. And wisely enough, you realize that we're friends, but we're not going to always agree on everything. So we need to form a government for this new island nation that we have. So in designing this government, do you think the people should have a right to pass whatever laws they want, as long as there's a majority vote? How many of you are okay with that? See one. Okay. Well, if you think that's okay, let me ask you to consider this. Suppose two of those island owners are young men, but one is a young lady. Buy a 2 to 3 boat, buy a 2 to 1 boat. Those two men can pass a law that they can have their way with that young lady anytime they want. That was done by a legitimate majority vote, pure democracy at work. I hope you're not okay with that idea. Or suppose those two young men get homesick and they decide to move back to the United States, but they sell the 2 parcels of land to 2 other men. Those men just happen to be Muslims who believe in Sharia law. Now that young lady is at the mercy of those men who believe in Sharia law. So there's a problem with this idea that majority makes right. When we ask about is that okay to determine rights that way, the real question that we're asking is, do you believe that might makes right? And if I just ask you that question, pretty much everybody would say no. We know that the bully may have the strength to take lunch money from the weaker child on the playground, but he doesn't have the right to take that money. But if you believe that man is the only source of our rights, then who's going to end up determining those rights? Those with the might, those who have the power, those who control the military in a nation, those who control the police force, those who get 51% of the vote in a democracy, those who control the Communist Party in communist nations. And we've seen the results of that, haven't we? Those governments that declared that man was the ultimate authority and that man was the source of human rights has murdered, by some estimates, over 100 million people in the last century alone. What's really amazing is the people who did the murdering thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were creating a utopia. Socialists have a favorite saying. They say you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Well, the broken eggs in these communist nations were the deaths of millions of their own citizens. And how did the omelet turn out? We know the Soviet Union collapsed financially. North Korea right now, you've probably been reading as I have, can't feed their own soldiers in the military. Their soldiers are sneaking away from their military posts and into towns to try to find a little bit of food to eat. You could go to the website called The Real Cuba and see the financial condition of the nation of Cuba right now. All of those people that determine that man's rights come from man. The financial collapse of these nations didn't occur because the people in these nations lacked intellect, because they lacked talent, because they lacked ingenuity, or because they lacked natural resources. These governments collapsed because they were based on an economic principle and a government principle on a false foundation that rights come from man, that there is no God, and that other men will determine your rights. These nations took away all the property rights of their citizens when they formed. And when you destroy property rights, you destroy all incentive for people to be productive. If I don't have a right to property, why am I going to invest any money that I have in a business if I can't reap the rewards from that business? Why would I risk going out and borrowing money from a bank to start a new business if I can't reap the rewards from that? So when we destroy property rights, we destroy productivity. And when that happens, the nation can't adequately feed its people. They can't adequately house their people. The buildings go into deterioration. They can't produce sufficient utilities to keep their nation running. I had the privilege of visiting the nation of Ukraine in the early 90s, right after the fall of the communist wall. And no doubt I caught them at probably the worst point in their history economically. But I saw the results of the effect of man's loss of rights. In the high-rise apartment that we stayed in for the 2 weeks I was there, they had some heat, fortunately. We were there in November, and the temperature never got as warm as freezing while I was there. You lived in long underwear always in those buildings. And we had small groups that came to the home where we stayed, and we interacted with people. And some nights they would report, well, we have no heat in our building tonight. Others would report, well, we have no hot water in our building tonight. They couldn't produce enough utilities to keep basic things like hot water and heat consistently on all the time. if you went into one of the few stores that was there with very, very limited items on the shelves.